What if the quickest way to lower your anxiety this month isn't to calm your thoughts, but to move your body for 90 seconds in a very specific way? And what if the thing you've been avoiding, forgiveness, is not a moral chore at all, but a performance enhancer for your nervous system that frees up attention, memory, and willpower? Stay with me, because by the end of this session, you'll understand why your mind has felt louder, why your body has been telling the truth more quickly than your beliefs, and how a short daily sequence can help you ride a turbulent season without losing yourself. There's a third thread I'll open now and return to later, when the world feels stranger. Unexplained events, shifting power, collective unrest, your brain predictably leans into threat. We'll turn that reflex into a skill. Before we go further, a humane disclaimer. What you're about to hear is general education, not individualized assessment, diagnosis, or treatment. I'm a clinician, but I'm not your personal clinician. Use what resonates, release what doesn't, and if you're in danger or thinking about harming yourself or someone else, contact local emergency services or crisis resources right now. Therapy is a courageous act. If you need support, seek a qualified professional where you live. Let's name the backdrop honestly. Many of you are carrying a heaviness you can't fully explain. You wake with a hum under the skin, a jitter that coffee didn't cause, and breathwork doesn't immediately erase. News cycles ricochet between conflict and controversy. Leaders change, rules shift, and what counted as stable last year feels conditional today. When the outer world becomes volatile, the inner world begins to mirror it unless you deliberately install shock absorbers in your routine. That's not spiritual bypassing, it's physiology. The nervous system is an exquisite antenna. It reads the room before the mind can narrate the room. In psychology, we call this bottom-up processing. Signals from the body race upward and shape meaning before top-down beliefs can organize them. If you've been trying to think your way out of a full-body alarm, you've been using the wrong wrench on the right bolt. This is why a month that feels loud benefits from a body-first approach. We can honor cognitive strategies, reframing, problem-solving, values clarification, while admitting they work better when the body is less flooded. Imagine renovating a house during an earthquake. You can redraw the floor plan, but you must stabilize the foundations first. In practice, this means brief, repeatable actions that discharge tension, recruit safety signals, and return you to the present. The evidence across multiple modalities converges here. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about behavioral activation and exposure. In acceptance and commitment therapy, we'd anchor to values and practice diffusion, the art of seeing thoughts as thoughts. In dialectical behavior therapy, we'd use distress tolerance skills that change body temperature, muscle tone, and breath. In attachment-based work, we'd co-regulate. Borrow another person's steady nervous system until your own steadies too. These are not competing religions. They are different lenses on the same organism trying to re-enter a window of tolerance. That flexible middle range in which you can feel fully and still choose wisely. Let me make this less abstract. I once worked with a composite patient I'll call Maya. She's a nurse leader who began saying yes to every extra shift when her team lost people to burnout. At first, she told herself it was temporary and noble. Then the yeses became an identity. She stopped exercising because there wasn't time, stopped setting boundaries because there wasn't language, and stopped sleeping because her body forgot how. When she finally sat in my office, she said something that I hear often in different forms. I think I broke something I can't repair. Maya had not broken. She had bent past capacity for too long. Burnout isn't just too much work, it's too little recovery while you work. The preventable part of her downfall was not weak character. It was weak boundaries that looked like kindness. We experimented with a small ritual she performed before she opened her email, before she stood up from her car to enter the hospital, and before she agreed to anything new. It took 90 seconds, and I'll teach you the structure later. Within a week, she was still busy, but her body wasn't sprinting when a walk would do. Within a month, she felt permission to say, "Not now," without apologizing. Her unit didn't fall apart. Her heroic overfunctioning did. That was the point. If you've ever felt what Maya felt, you already understand how the body keeps score, even when the mind tells a story. Trauma theory uses that phrase to describe how unprocessed stress embeds in posture, breathing, startle response, even digestion. You don't have to identify with a trauma label to benefit from trauma-informed care. All it means is that we assume you've lived through things that exceeded your resources, we avoid shaming and power games, and we organize treatment to maximize safety, choice, and collaboration. Think of it as the difference between a teacher who says, "Sit down and be quiet," and a mentor who says, "How do we make this room safe enough that your best thinking can happen?" When the external world is divisive and loud, a trauma-informed stance is not a luxury. It's the doorway back to clarity. Another composite I'll call Koa illustrates a different arc, the delayed awakening. He built a life on competence: engineer, reliable friend, good son. For decades, he didn't feel much, which he wore like a medal. Then, without warning, he was ambushed by symptoms: tight chest on Sunday evenings, short fuse with people he loved, an ache he couldn't exercise away. We mapped his week and found something precise. He was living at the edge of fawn mode, the survival strategy where you defer and appease to stay safe. No one had taught him that as a child. He learned to predict the weather and other people and adjust himself to prevent storms. In adulthood, the same brilliance at reading a room had become a prison. He wasn't choosing his values, he was avoiding friction. Once he saw the pattern, we used ACT principles. First, catch the story. If I say no, I'll lose belonging. Second, let the story ride in the back seat while he drove anyway. Say one small no per day aligned with a bigger yes. At first, it felt rude. Then, it felt honest. His anxiety didn't vanish, but it became information, not a verdict. That's an awakening. Not mystical fireworks, but turning toward what you've been avoiding and discovering it was smaller than the shadow it cast. Some of you are skeptical of forgiveness. I don't blame you. The word has been misused to pressure people, especially those with less power, to absorb harm quietly. In clinical work, we define forgiveness carefully. It is not forgetting, excusing, minimizing, or reconciling. It does not eliminate accountability. It does not require continued relationship. Forgiveness, as I use it here, is the internal act of releasing your nervous system from the job of keeping the other person's offense alive as proof. It's a boundary inside the body. I will not spend another year paying interest on a debt I cannot collect. There's research suggesting that when you move out of chronic grievance into a stance of release, markers of stress shift. Sleep improves, rumination decreases, pro-social behavior returns. You don't have to want reconciliation to want your focus back. The paradox is that many people attempt manifesting, goal setting, visualization, building new habits, while dragging old grievances like ankle weights. The system can't sprint that way. If you're open to it, we'll practice a small forgiveness drill later, 5 sentences long, done privately. You will feel your heart resist. Let your hands help. We'll recruit the body to escort the mind. It's also normal that some of you are reporting oddness you can't name, unusual dreams, uncanny coincidences, a sense that the boundary between inner and outer feels thinner. I'm not here to adjudicate metaphysics. I am here to tell you that humans are meaning-making creatures, and when the world feels unstable, we widen the net for explanations. In cognitive science, we call this predictive processing. The brain constantly models the future and updates the model with new data. During uncertainty, that model gets noisy, and we are more likely to notice patterns, attribute agency, or interpret anomalies as significant. That doesn't mean nothing unusual is happening. It means your instrument panel is more sensitive. The assignment is the same: ground first, interpret second. If you've had experiences that feel beyond your normal map, bring them to a safe relationship where they can be held without ridicule or exaggeration. Psychological safety doesn't collapse mystery, it gives it a container. Let's return to the question of power, because many of you are living in systems, families, workplaces, communities, where decisions are being made without you, yet the consequences live in your body. The phrase people versus power can harden into cynicism if you're not careful. What we see clinically is more nuanced. Humans have a strong fairness reflex. When it's violated, we experience moral injury. Distress that arises when our values are betrayed by those we trusted or by our own actions under pressure. Moral injury feels different from burnout. Burnout says, I'm exhausted. Moral injury says, this is wrong. Treating the first without acknowledging the second doesn't work. So we pair skills that restore energy with actions that restore integrity. Sometimes that means micro-activism, not a grand gesture, but bringing your daily behavior into alignment with what you believe. Don't underestimate the regulation that returns when your actions and values stop arguing. I promised a body-first sequence you can perform in about 7 minutes. I'll teach the whole thing in a later segment because I want you to understand why it works before you try to memorize it. Here's the principle. When the nervous system is overloaded, it helps to move through 3 gates in order. The first communicates to ancient circuitry that you are physically safe enough right now. The second recruits rhythm to synchronize signals that got out of phase: breath, heartbeat, muscle tone. The third narrows attention on one meaningful act that restores agency, even if the external situation hasn't changed. 3 gates, 1 sequence, repeatable anywhere. That is how you build shock absorbers. You don't negotiate with your thoughts. You show your body something undeniable and let your thoughts catch up. You may notice a tension in yourself. Part of you wants to accelerate this month, to declare a new identity, cut ties that no longer fit, claim a different future, while another part wants to hide under the softest blanket and not move. That tension is not pathology. It's a healthy argument between safety and growth. We help by making growth safer and safety less stagnant. In practice, that means scaling change to your current window. If you feel frozen, your task isn't to leap, it's to thaw. If you feel frantic, your task isn't to do more, it's to do deliberately. The worst advice in a loud season is push harder. The better advice is push where leverage is high and cost is low. In therapy, we find those points by tracking sensation, emotion, image, meaning, and behavior like 5 instruments on a dashboard. If 3 are in the red, we downshift. If 1 is in the green, we build there first. There's a final composite I'll introduce now that will follow later. I'll call her Lynn. She came to therapy not for crisis, but for recalibration. Her words were precise. My life looks good on paper. I don't want a new life. I want a new way to live this one. That is a sophisticated goal. Lynn didn't need a sledgehammer, she needed a lens. We began with a simple act exercise. Write down 5 verbs that describe how you want to live, not outcomes you want to achieve. She picked listen, build, protect, learn, and delight. Then we placed those verbs into her calendar, not as extra tasks, but as ways to do the existing tasks. Listening turned mundane meetings into practice. Build turned chores into design. Protect turned bedtime into a boundary. Learn turned mistakes into data. Delight turned meals into a pause. When she felt the month surge around her, she returned to verbs. That is values-based living in plain language. It doesn't fight the noise, it amplifies the signal you care about until it becomes the loudest thing in the room. If you feel resistant to all of this, I respect that too. Skepticism is a boundary that asks for evidence. The data you want will be experiential. Try the smallest version of what we're discussing for 1 week, not because I say so, but because your nervous system deserves an experiment as fair as the ones you run for your job or your kids. Many of you will discover that what looked like a mindset problem was a physiology problem with a marketing budget. Once the body softens, the mind gets smarter. Once attention returns, choices multiply. Once choices multiply, hope stops being a mood and becomes a skill. Let's circle back to the opening loop about forgiveness as a performance enhancer. When you release a grievance, not erase it, not reconcile with it, you reduce rumination, that mental habit of replaying the same scenes and rehearsing future confrontations. Rumination feels productive because it uses effort. It is often a disguised avoidance. As rumination decreases, cognitive load drops. You don't have to believe anything spiritual to enjoy the downstream effects. Better working memory, more reliable focus, faster transitions between tasks, and more social bandwidth for the people in front of you. If the word forgiveness still bristles, substitute release or closure. The body doesn't care which noun you pick. It cares that you stop fueling a circuit designed to protect you from harm that is no longer occurring. There's a quiet dignity in saying, I will remember what happened and still refuse to grant it my next hour. There is also the matter of abundance, another term that belongs to human psychology as much as it belongs to self-help. In clinical language, abundance maps to sufficiency, having enough of what your organism needs to thrive, not infinite resources, but adequate resources allocated in line with values. During noisy seasons, abundance is not achieved by acquiring more inputs, but by reducing leakage. Where is your attention leaking? Where is your energy leaking? Where is your compassion leaking? Sometimes the leaks are small. A notification feed tuned to outrage, a relationship that runs on sarcasm, a nightly habit that looked like relaxation but robs sleep. You do not have to overhaul your life to feel abundance return. You have to patch 2 leaks and defend 1 value in motion every day. That is not glamorous. It is astonishingly effective. Some of you worry that becoming more boundaried will make you selfish or cold. That fear is common in people who learn to secure love by becoming useful. The truth I see in practice is the opposite. People with clean boundaries are clearer givers. They give on purpose, not to manage other people's perceptions. They say yes with their whole body because they reserve the right to say no. That clarity reduces resentment, which is the toxin that makes help feel heavy. If you want your generosity back, your boundary is not a gate that locks. It's a hinge that lets the door swing without ripping off the frame. I told you earlier that I would give you a daily sequence. We'll build it piece by piece so that when you practice, you're not reciting magic words. You're cooperating with your biology. The first piece is the signal of immediate physical safety. This is where many protocols fail because they stay in the head. Safety must be shown to muscles and breath, not argued in sentences. We'll do that by recruiting a brief movement that loads large muscle groups, then a pattern of exhale-weighted breathing that tells the vagus nerve you're not under chase, and finally a grounded orienting glance that reminds your midbrain there is no predator in the room. You do not need a therapist present to do this. You need 2 square meters, 90 seconds, and willingness. We're going to take all of this somewhere practical. You're going to have days this month when the world feels like it's vibrating and your own life asks you to make decisions anyway. On those days, you will carry a short ritual like a pocket tool. The ritual cannot make the world quieter. It will make you steadier. Steadier people make cleaner choices. Clean choices compound. Compounded choices change a month, and a changed month changes a year. That is how we turn a tumultuous season into a hinge, something the door of your life can swing on without collapsing the frame. For now, pause and notice one honest thing. Which sentence today gave your body a tiny sigh of relief? Mark it. We're going to use it as an anchor when we practice. When we speak again, I will walk you through the 90-second reset, the 5-sentence release, and the 1 act of agency that closes the loop so you don't carry unfinished adrenaline into sleep. We'll also rejoin Maya, Koa, and Lynn as they test these tools in ugly, ordinary days, the only kind of day most healing happens in. Let's keep the promise and make the invisible practical, beginning with the 90-second reset you can carry in a pocket and use before a hard conversation, before opening your inbox, or when your chest feels like it has a small storm inside it. You'll move through 3 gates, not as magic, but as cooperation with a body that wants to help you think clearly. First, you show your oldest circuitry that you are safe enough right now by asking large muscles to work briefly. Even 10 slow wall presses or a steady isometric hold against a doorframe can do it. Muscles talk to the brain in a language older than words, and a short bout of effort tells ancient systems to stand down. Then you guide breath toward a longer exhale than inhale so carbon dioxide rises slightly and the vagus nerve reads the moment as non-chase. An easy pattern is to breathe in through the nose and let the out-breath lengthen like a soft sigh through the mouth, as if you're fogging a window you don't need to clean. Finally, you orient with your eyes. Not quickly but deliberately, letting your head and gaze turn to clock the real room you're in. The shape of the doorframe, the texture of the floor, the patch of light on the wall. So your midbrain updates the map from imagined threat to present facts. If you stitch that into a single arc, brief load, exhale, weighted breath, gentle orienting, you use the very same ingredients that multiple therapies combine under different names. The intense exercise and paced breathing of DBT's distress tolerance skills, the bottom-up grounding favored in trauma-informed care, and the attentional redirect that cognitive approaches have always used but too often ask the mind to do without recruiting the body. The sequence doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. When it works, you won't float away. You'll feel your weight again and find that thoughts stop shouting and begin to speak at a human volume. I asked Maya to use this before every decision point that used to pull her into automatic yes. The first day she forgot twice and apologized to me. I told her apologies were unnecessary and curiosity was the work. The third day, she remembered to press her palms into the steering wheel before walking into the hospital. She noticed her shoulders drop without trying to drop them, which meant the change was real rather than cosmetic. A week later, when a supervisor asked for coverage, she still felt the tug of habit, that reflexive reach for the superhero cape, but she also felt the floor under her feet. In that small gap, she found a sentence that had been missing from her vocabulary. I can help for 2 hours, and then I will connect you with the coordinator. Her unit survived the limit. Her nervous system learned that boundaries did not cause collapse, and because the lesson arrived in her muscles and breath, it was hard to argue with. Clinically, what we saw looked like a finer-grained version of the symptom shifts people describe when they begin to live inside their window of tolerance more often. Rumination down, irritability down, decision quality up. None of this is a miracle. It is mechanics. Koa's turn came when Sunday evening still felt like a narrowing hallway. He suspected correctly that the dread attached to work but carried the face of older patterns. The child who earned safety by anticipating everyone else's needs was running the adult schedule. We added a second tool I promised earlier, a 5-sentence release. I designed it so no sentence depended on the others, which meant he could do one on a train platform or all 5 at his kitchen table. The first sentence names what happened in the most neutral language he can manage, not the courtroom drama of "they always" and "I never," but the plain weather report that tells a brain exactly what cloud it is seeing. The second sentence names the cost so his body hears him acknowledge reality. People who fawn for belonging often skip this part and pay with hidden resentment. The third sentence is the hinge. I release my nervous system from the job of replaying this as proof. He rarely believed it the first time he wrote it, which is fine. We are training a stance, not chasing a feeling. The fourth sentence makes room for justice without confusing forgiveness with forgetting. I can release this and still hold boundaries and accountability. The final sentence redirects energy toward a value or a task he wants to fund, not to perform productivity theater, but to prevent the vacuum that ruminations eagerly fill. On the page, those lines look simple. In the body, they can feel like lifting a door that used to be stuck. 2 Sundays later, the hallway was still narrow, but there was a window in it. He used the 90-second reset at the window and then wrote the 5 lines, not as penance, as maintenance. The dread did not evaporate. It thawed, and thawed dread is easier to shape. Lynn, with her quiet precision, needed the third tool, the one act of agency. Agency is not control over others or over the world. It is the clean right to initiate one value-aligned action in a noisy situation. We kept it small on purpose. Large plans are attractive when life feels chaotic because they offer the fantasy of total order. They also fail loudly when the world ignores them. A single deliberate act succeeds more often and teaches the lesson her nervous system needs. I can move something today. She chose to anchor protect to the hour before sleep. That meant no screens after a certain time, not as self-punishment, but as a defense of her cognitive clarity tomorrow. It also meant that when an evening social plan threatened the hour, she chose whether to trade it consciously instead of resenting it later. The math looked boring from the outside. From the inside, it changed her day's texture. Over months, she added listen to 1 meeting a day, where she would speak last on purpose, build to a weekly session where she improved one system by 1%, learn to a short debrief after mistakes, and delight to one undistracted cup of tea. None of those acts made headlines. All of them made a life that felt like hers. I want to pull back the curtain on why these tools matter in a month that feels unstable. Under uncertainty, the human brain defaults to short-term threat management. It narrows perspective, prioritizes speed over nuance, and treats ambiguity as danger. That was excellent design when the threats were teeth and claws. It can be costly when the threats are social, political, or existential. The reset, the release, and the single act are 3 ways to smuggle nuance back in. Nuance returns when the body is less flooded. You can hear information you couldn't hear when adrenaline had the microphone. Nuance returns when grievance is not consuming your attentional budget. You can detect opportunity that grievance would have painted over. Nuance returns when you choose one thing that matches your values. You remember that meaning is built, not found. The evidence for each element comes from different corners. Studies on paced breathing and vagal tone, randomized trials supporting behavioral activation and implementation intentions, decades of outcome research showing that common factors like expectancy, alliance, and perceived agency predict change, but the effect in a single day is simpler to evaluate. You either feel steadier afterward or you don't. If you don't, we adjust the dose and the order. If you do, we keep the settings until you need new ones. Rigor here means humility about mechanism and clarity about outcome. Earlier, I touched the theme that some of you are encountering experiences that don't fit your usual map, dreams that feel like messages, coincidences that pile up, a sense of thinness between inner and outer. I will neither hype nor dismiss this. My job is to protect your ability to think while honoring your right to wonder. Predictive processing research tells us that when baseline uncertainty increases, the brain raises its sensitivity to patterns and can attribute meaning more readily. That sensitivity is not a flaw. It's a feature that has helped us survive. The cost is that we can see faces in clouds and miss the ground under our feet. The remedy is the same remedy that helps with anxiety and grief and moral injury. Ground first, interpret second, and wherever possible, interpret in community, so you aren't carrying the entire meaning-making task alone. I've sat with people who feared they were unraveling and discovered they were, in fact, attentively grieving. I've sat with others whose anomalous experiences quieted once their sleep and diet improved. And yes, I've sat with a few whose experiences stayed odd under every ordinary explanation. We kept their feet on the floor and kept asking better questions. Curiosity is not the enemy of safety. It is often the path to it. Let's give the 90-second reset a home and a rhythm so it isn't a novelty you forget by Friday. Place it at 3 thresholds you cross anyway: before you consume news or social feeds, before you make a decision that affects another person, and before you attempt to sleep. A threshold is an honest place because you are neither where you were nor where you're going. The nervous system is briefly uncommitted, which makes it teachable. At the feet threshold, the brief muscle load slows the reflex to scroll, the exhale-weighted breath makes it easier to choose deliberately, and the orienting glance reminds you that your room is not on fire, even if headlines are. At the decision threshold, the same sequence makes it more likely you will speak from values rather than from fear of disapproval. At the sleep threshold, the short dose of movement plus breath invites a downshift that screens will hijack if you offer them your eyes. People often ask for the right number of repetitions. I prefer a right-sized promise. Do it once a day when things are quiet and twice on hard days. If you miss, restart without self-attack. Shame is a poor teacher. You may already be wondering how forgiveness fits here without becoming a scold. I want to prove to the part of you that is allergic to moralizing that release is a cognitive upgrade, not a character test. When we hold a grievance close, our mind returns to it to maintain identity coherence. I am the person to whom this was done. I am the person who must make it known. There is dignity in naming harm. The injury becomes sticky, though, when identity fuses with the grievance. The 5 sentences loosen the fusion without erasing the event. That loosening shows up in ordinary metrics we can track without a lab. Fewer off-topic thought loops during tasks, lower perceived effort to begin a new activity, more tolerance for minor frustrations, and a less brittle tone in conversations that used to break. If you practice for a week and notice none of these shifts, you owe yourself a recalibration, not a harsher lecture. Sometimes you are trying to forgive an open system that is still hurting you. In that case, the task is not release, but protection. Sometimes you are trying to forgive while sleep-deprived. The task is not metaphysical, but metabolic. Sometimes you're trying to forgive the unnameable, like randomness. The task is to mourn, not to absolve. Precision is kindness. The storyline of people versus power will continue around you whether you watch the news or not. Your nervous system will carry a piece of that storyline no matter what you do. This is why moral injury requires more than self-care. You restore yourself by taking actions that square your behavior with your beliefs, even when those actions are small and local. Maya's version looked like advocating for a humane scheduling change and refusing to participate in shaming colleagues who needed time off. Koa's version looked like declining to laugh at a joke that embarrassed a junior teammate and saying calmly, "We don't do that here." Lynn's version looked like saying yes to 1 pro bono consult per month, rather than vaguely promising to help more someday. None of these acts toppled a system. All of them loosened the moral knot in a single body, which is where any credibility to speak about big systems is forged. If you have ever felt that your nervous system was too alert to the world's pain, this is how you give it something constructive to do with that alertness. Anxiety often asks for certainty and speed. Healing asks for accuracy and rhythm. Rhythm matters because bodies learn by repetition. Accuracy matters because repeating the wrong thing simply deepens a groove you'll have to climb out of later. This is why I return to the image of the hinge. You do not need to rebuild the door today. You need the door to swing without tearing the frame. For some of you, the hinge is sleep. For others, it is a conversation you have been avoiding. For others, it is nourishment that has become irregular. We locate the hinge by watching where a small change produces a large effect. You can feel the hinge when you touch it because the rest of the day moves more freely afterward. This is not a metaphor to admire. It is an instruction to test. There is one more move I want to add to your repertoire before we rejoin the stories. It's a micro practice I teach people who feel hijacked by a single thought that repeats like a song fragment and runs the show. Thought stopping rarely works for long. What helps is to notice the moment a thought becomes sticky, when it shifts from a passing headline to a command, and shift your stance from believer to observer without trying to wrestle the content. In ACT, this is called diffusion. In plain English, it sounds like there's a thought that says, if I don't answer this message right now, I'll be forgotten. Thank you, mind. I'm going to choose a 15-minute delay and see what happens. The respectful tone is not performative. It's strategic. Treating the mind like an enemy often prompts it to shout louder. Treating it like a well-intended but excitable assistant gives you room to lead. I've watched executives, teachers, parents, and artists reclaim hours of focus by practicing this 3 or 4 times a day for 1 week. Again, not a miracle. Mechanics. Back to Maya, because preventable downfalls teach so well. Her meltdown didn't come from a single catastrophe. It came from thousands of small, reasonable compromises that added up to self-neglect. After a month, she could tell, often to the hour, when she slipped under the level of fuel she needed to think well. She implemented one correction that felt embarrassingly small. She put 10 minutes of protected transition between her shift and her first act at home, even if that meant sitting in the car outside her apartment with her eyes closed. At first, her partner mocked the ritual gently. Then he noticed she came in kinder. Behavior that produces relief soon gains allies. A clinician could map this to stimulus control or to shaping. She experienced it as sanity. Back to Koa, because delayed awakenings require care. He feared that if he stopped appeasing, he would become unkind. He worried that honesty would make him hard. The opposite happened. When he chose one small refusal per day in service of a clearer yes, he found he had more warmth for people he used to resent. He also found that some relationships preferred the old version of him and grew cooler. That loss hurt. We named it as loss rather than evidence he had done something wrong. Attachment theory helps here. If your earliest template for closeness included self-erasure, intimacy without erasure will feel alien at first, like walking on a boat. You're not failing. You're learning to stand in a moving room. And back to Lynn, because transformation that works is rarely dramatic. She came one day with a quiet victory. She had taken a meeting with a colleague who tends to fill the air with certainty and left without the usual agitation. I asked what changed. She said she did the reset in the hallway, decided in advance to let one silence stretch 2 heartbeats longer than comfort after each of his assertions, and ended the meeting 2 minutes early on purpose. Nothing in the content was different. Everything in the container was. She discovered that agency sometimes looks like a pause you protect, not a speech you perfect. I want you to notice how each of these people used the same basic ingredients and arrived at different textures. That is the point. We start with shared physiology and shared principles because human bodies are more alike than different. We customize where your history, context, and values ask us to. Evidence-based doesn't mean one size fits all. It means we draw from methods that, across many people, reliably move the needle, and we monitor closely so that, for you, we are moving the needle you actually care about. Across modalities, one pattern shows up stubbornly in the research and in the room. Improvements in sleep, social support, and a sense of agency amplify everything else. When I'm unsure where to push, I push gently on those 3. When I'm wrong, the cost is small. When I'm right, momentum appears. The month may still roar around you. Leadership may shift. The public conversation may rise and fall in waves that make you seasick. You are not required to become a monk or a hermit to keep your balance. You are required to become a little more deliberate. Deliberateness looks unglamorous from a distance. A human standing still for 90 seconds in a hallway. Another human writing 5 sentences no one will see. Another choosing one action that fits a value rather than a mood. Those moves return you to yourself so you can decide what to say and where to stand. When more of us do this privately, the public tone changes a notch at a time. It is slow work. It is sturdy. Before we close for now, scan your day and choose the threshold where the 90-second reset will live next. Picture the wall or the door frame or the place you'll stand. Decide, in a sentence you could speak to a friend, which value you will fund with one act that takes 15 minutes or less. If the word forgiveness still feels like a stone in your shoe, promise yourself 5 private lines tonight without forcing catharsis. Then let the rest of the world be as loud as it wants. You'll meet it with a steadier instrument. When we pick up again, we will assemble these pieces into a 7-minute circuit. You can run morning and night. We'll name the signs that tell you you're over or undercorrecting, and we'll close the loop on sleep so your nights stop borrowing from your days. As promised, we'll stitch the pieces into a rhythm you can perform in about 7 minutes without turning your morning into a seminar. Start by giving your body the first word. Let some brief load into large muscles, not as a workout, but as a signal that you are here and capable. Press your palms into a wall and feel the slow count in your forearms. Or sink into a half squat you can hold without strain, and let the heat rise just enough to be unmistakable. Ride that signal into an exhale that lingers longer than the inhale. Not forced, just slightly generous, the way air leaves when you decide to stop performing for a moment. Let your gaze complete the circuit by turning to meet the actual room you are in, naming silently a few unremarkable details that would not exist if danger were present. You have taken 90 seconds, and you have already changed what your brain expects from the next minute. From there, give your mind something structured and kind. Place one honest sentence on a page describing what you're carrying from yesterday that still wants to follow you. Don't litigate it, just label the weather. Add a second sentence that names the cost, because bodies relax when reality is acknowledged. Offer the hinge the third sentence provides and tell your nervous system it may retire from replaying this moment as proof. You don't need to feel the truth of it yet for the instruction to matter. Hold space for boundaries and accountability in the fourth, so you don't accidentally tell yourself that healing means pretending nothing happened. Land the fifth on a value you want to fund today, so attention has somewhere better to live than the loop. Close with a single act of agency you can do in 15 minutes or less that makes your day more like your life rather than like your fear. If that act belongs to sleep tonight, laying out your book where your phone usually sits, filling the glass you'll use for water, dimming a lamp 1 hour earlier, do it now in miniature. Because future you is easier to help when you make room in advance rather than aspiration at midnight. The 7 minutes end not with a flourish, but with a small yes you can feel in your posture. You have created a hinge and the day can swing. You know what practice matters, when it changes how stories land rather than how sentences sound. The week Maya moved this circuit to the hospital parking lot, she stopped walking into the building already behind. There is a difference between being busy and being braced. The wall press and the slow out breath took the brace out of her shoulders, and the 5 lines took the reheated arguments out of her head. Before she met the first human, when the shift ran long, she wrote the 4th sentence quietly in the medroom so her body would have permission to keep its boundaries without turning them into a fight. By the end of the month, she could tell which asks were urgent and which were simply loud. The outcomes looked ordinary from the outside. Fewer errors, fewer apologies, fewer late-night spirals. But inside her system, there was a new fact. Steadiness was not something she earned when everything calmed down. It was something she could bring with her into rooms that would never be calm. Koa discovered that the circuit worked best just before the hour he used to dread. He pressed his hands into the kitchen counter, exhaled like a human rather than a hostage, and looked around like a person whose life was not a courtroom. The 5 sentences did not make his job less demanding. They made the job less entangled with old vows he didn't remember making. The single act of agency he chose on most days was laughably small. He delayed a response he used to fire off immediately. Not to punish anyone, but to protect the version of himself that answers from values rather than from appeasement. 2 weeks later, he reported something that sounded trivial and was not. He had gone an entire morning without the background thought that every pause equals rejection. He had not eliminated his sensitivity. He had given it something steadier to hold. Lynn installed the circuit twice a day without ceremony. Morning gave her the shape of the day. Evening returned what the day had taken. In the morning, she angled the act of agency toward build, so that at least one system in her world, her calendar, her kitchen, her team's shared document, improved by 1% while the world made noise. At night, the act leaned toward protect, and she treated sleep as the meeting tomorrow depends on, because it does. Where she once chased sleep, she now staged it. 90 seconds of movement prevented the heavy head from becoming a restless body in bed. The long exhale and the soft orienting unhooked her mind from screens, and the 5 sentences became an agreement with the night that unsolved problems would be met by a rested brain rather than by a vigilant one. She didn't win every night. She won enough to remember what good days feel like. As you practice, you will wonder if you are doing too much or too little. The signs of overcorrection are surprisingly reliable. If the rituals begin to feel like superstition rather than support, if your boundaries sound brittle where they used to sound clear, if you keep choosing isolation and calling it peace, You may be leaning too far away from life. The antidote is not to abandon the tools, but to make them more social and more flexible. Do the reset with someone, even on a call where you both agree to breathe, rather than fill the silence. Write the 5 sentences once this week with a therapist or a trusted friend listening, not to be corrected, but to be witnessed. Choose an act of agency that brings you into gentle contact with the world you've been avoiding rather than furnishing the bunker. Undercorrection announces itself differently. If doom scrolling sneaks through the door you swore you locked, if your sleep is a negotiation that starts losing at the same minute each night, if every decision is urgent and yet nothing moves, you may be asking for cognitive wins while your physiology still believes it is cornered. In that case, we increase the body's share. Add a degree of intensity to the muscle load without punishing yourself. Make the exhale a little longer and the mouth softer. Orient to the room until you can count 3 harmless details without rushing. Some people need to lower the light earlier or drop the room's temperature a notch. Others need to put the most emotionally charged task nowhere near the hour they plan to sleep. There is no prize for choosing the hardest setting. There is relief for choosing the right one. The sleep loop closes when you stop treating night as the trash bin for the day's unresolved tension and start treating it as the preparation for tomorrow's judgment. This is not romance. It is evidence that shows up wherever humans track their moods honestly. People who defend a gentle slope into the first half hour of sleep report days that carry less residue and interactions that require less repair. You don't need a device to test this. Give yourself a dusk, even if the city you live in does not. Dim one light a little earlier than habit, put your phone where your hand cannot reach it without standing, and make the 90-second reset the last thing that happens on purpose before you let the night happen on its own. When thoughts return with their arguments, borrow something from cognitive science called the cognitive shuffle, a playful drift of images or syllables that distracts the mind without engaging it. Imagine an alphabetical walk through a farmer's market, or sketch the outline of an unfamiliar city block in your head without solving anything on it. If the mind refuses, get out of bed kindly and give it 10 minutes in a chair with low light and a boring paragraph before inviting sleep again. Sleep is less a beast to conquer than a guest to welcome with consistent cues. Some of you will ask where the data live in everything we are doing. The interventions here borrow from places where randomized trials, meta-analyses, and decades of clinical observation overlap. Movement that preferentially recruits large muscle groups and brief bouts of exertion can alter arousal quickly. Paced breathing with longer exhales nudges the autonomic balance toward parasympathetic tone and helps with emotion regulation. Orienting pulls attention back to sensory present rather than threat simulation and calms midbrain alarm. Behavioral activation increases contact with reinforcement and reduces passivity. Values-based action reorganizes behavior around meaning, which sustains change better than rule-following alone. Thought diffusion reduces the stickiness of cognitive content and protects focus. And sleep hygiene, to the extent that phrase has been overused, still rests on straightforward physics of light, temperature, and routine. Evidence is not uniform and human variability is real, which is why we treat results as feedback rather than doctrine. On days when your body argues with the science, your body wins and we adjust. On weeks when nothing works, we don't escalate shame. We widen the team and bring in medical, nutritional, or social supports. Because sometimes the thing you call willpower is just low fuel. The larger world will continue to offer you scenes that make your jaw clench and your attention scatter. Leadership may change, policies may rattle, and stories may compete for your outrage the way vendors compete for your eye. You are not obligated to carry every battle inside your chest. You are invited to turn moral injury into moral clarity and then into bite-sized action, the kind that lets you look at yourself without flinching. Maya did that when she refused to participate in a culture of quiet punishment for people who asked for help. Koa did that when he allowed a moment of discomfort to protect a junior colleague from becoming the butt of a joke. Lynn did that when she ended a meeting on time and used those 2 rescued minutes to text a kind sentence she had been postponing. The nervous system trusts you more when your values and your calendar stop contradicting each other. This month may still feel strange. You may notice coincidences that taste like messages or dreams that insist on being remembered. Hold them lightly, as you would a shell you pick up from the beach. Turn them in your hand, listen if there is sound, return them to the tide if they are heavy. Ground first. Interpret second. Share your sense-making with someone who can hold wonder and skepticism in the same palm. Brains that regulate together hallucinate less alone. If one day something refuses every ordinary explanation, keep your feet on the floor and your questions honest. Mystery is not the enemy of mental health. Pretending you don't need a floor is. Return with me to the opening promise that sounded like a dare. Yes, moving your body for 90 seconds can be the shortest path to quieter thoughts when the month is loud. Not because movement is magic, but because ancient circuits read muscle and breath more quickly than they read mantras. Yes, forgiveness can act like a performance enhancer, not because it sanctifies harm or requires reconciliation, but because it releases a loop that steals working memory and attention from the tasks and relationships that deserve them. And yes, when the world feels stranger, your threat detection will flare. Rather than trying to shame it into silence, you can train it into a skill that serves you, the way a skilled sailor reads the wind without cursing it for blowing. The payoff for staying this long is not a certificate. It is a handful of moves you can repeat until they become boring in the best way, the kind of boring that lets your life get interesting again. Keep what works, modify what almost works, and set down what doesn't without dramatizing the goodbye. If you are carrying something heavier than tools can hold, reach for a clinician where you live. General education is not a substitute for personal care, and there is no shame in needing a team. If you are at risk of harming yourself or someone else, choose safety now and contact emergency services or crisis resources in your region. If you are steady enough to experiment, let tomorrow morning start with the circuit. Let tomorrow evening end with the slope into sleep. And let one conversation in the middle of the day benefit from a pause you protect on purpose. When you are ready to keep going, the next natural topic is grief literacy, the craft of letting go without erasing, of making room for joy without betraying what you loved. We can go there together, not because it is fashionable, but because learning to end well is part of learning to live well.